Hello, class. Today we're going to be talking about swallowing abilities in older adults. We're going to be focusing primarily on healthy older adults. Now, people mean different things when they talk about the older part of our population. Today, I'm going to be discussing primarily people who are in their 80s and older who may have very subtle differences in their swallowing as compared to our normal expectations for someone who's in their 20s, 30s, and 40s. So let's begin by talking about the changes that we know are associated with the aging process in general. For example, we know that tissue elasticity decreases. Specifically, we can talk about the tissue elasticity in cartilaginous structures. We know that the epiglottis, for example, becomes less flexible as we age. But that's something specific to aging as it relates to swallowing. Let's go back to general changes that we might notice in someone who is 80 or older. We know that sensory receptors decrease in number. These would include kinesthetic receptors, and these receptors also decrease in their effectiveness. So there are fewer available receptors to take sensory information to the brain. And the ones that are there may decrease their speed, may just be less effective at processing sensory stimuli. We also know that the elderly often have muscle wasting, that is, a loss of muscle mass as we age. This is also called sarcopenia. And sarcopenia takes place mostly as a result of non-use, but there are some aspects of muscle wasting that seems to accompany normal aging in most people, even when there's an effort to remain active. So this would include gross motor large muscles, but it also affects smaller muscles like the ones that we're concerned about. We know that elderly people often have fatigue and do not have the stamina that they used to have with regard to physical activity. We may not be used to thinking about eating as a physical activity, but it is, and many aspects of eating are associated with effort. So not the least of that would be social demands on eating occasions. And in addition to the social demands, we know that eating requires muscular effort. It requires sustained attention and completion of a task. So fatigue can be something that can affect older people as they go about their daily life. We know that geriatric patients can also demonstrate less appetite, less food intake, and can demonstrate what we can call geriatric failure to thrive. Failure to thrive essentially means inability to take in enough nutrients in order to sustain healthy body functions. So this is something that concerns almost everyone who works with a geriatric population, and you may have had family members who, as they get older, just don't seem to be as hungry as they used to. Again, I think some of this is due to decrease in sensory receptors. You can't smell the food, the food doesn't taste as good, so it perhaps is no wonder that as we age, there is a tendency to eat less. So overall, what do we know? We know that motor skill decreases with age. We also know that there is decreased acuity with age, and acuity for sensory information. And we're used to thinking about this with regard to hearing, but it's also true for the other senses as well. Physicians often say that skills become decompensated. That means that skills, we're talking about swallowing, can become less effective, less integrated, less coordinated. In general, they don't accomplish the purpose for which we have those skills. So we could say that swallowing and motor skills in general are decompensated in the aging process. So let's go ahead now and get specific about what we know about the aging process as it relates to swallowing structures. We know there is decreased saliva. We've already talked about decreased sensory receptors and sensory reception, acquisition of that sensory information. We know that there can be a loss of bone mass. Again, we're used to thinking about that in sort of a gross muscle and bone or appendage situation, but it's also true in terms of dentition and the combined effect of changes in osseous structures and in muscle mass may affect functionality of the temporomandibular joint, or the TMJ. We know that the larynx becomes more calcified over time, and that is, the cartilage becomes more like bone as we age. I hinted at this on the page before when I said that certain osseous or certain connective structures become less flexible. The example was the epiglottis, but because the larynx is composed of multiple cartilages, this becomes a widespread problem, and it affects the readiness with which structures in the larynx can change position and move. We've already talked about the next 2 points. That is, the sensory receptors decrease in number, and there's muscle wasting or sarcopenia. And specifically for us, then it's going to be muscles that are powerful in the oral stage. So that would be the masseter. That would be muscles in the tongue. That would be musculature that's responsible for elevating the velum. And it certainly is the case that it could affect the pharyngeal constrictors. The bottom line is that eating is less rewarding for individuals who are older. It may require more effort, and meals may take longer. Again, the entire act of deglutition, that is to take in food, is somewhat different for elderly clients. Let's talk now about the sort of larger issue about what is normal. Always an important and interesting question with regard to swallowing and older individuals. So if it's true that swallowing and bodies change as we age, then should we consider those changes to be normal? Most of the studies that I've read indicate that while there are changes in the swallowing abilities of elderly persons, those changes are not severe enough to be considered pathological. We will, of course, begin with the oral stage or oral stages as we talk about the changes in deglutition in normal elderly. There has been established that there is slowing of movement, that the structures such as the tongue become less efficient, and that there is increased oral transit time. There are some changes also in the position of the bolus. The bolus location in older individuals tends to be either slightly more anterior or more posterior in the oral cavity. You'll hear the terms tipper and dipper with regard to swallowing. Tipper is what the usual or the young adult normal activity is, where the swallow is initiated with the tip of the tongue and the bolus is located on top of the tongue, making it easy for the tip of the tongue to move posteriorly along the palate. Dippers, on the other hand, initially put the bolus underneath the anterior portion of the tongue. in order to move the bolus from posterior towards the posterior aspect, the tongue needs to dip under the bolus first and bring the bolus to the supralingual position. Now, being a dipper is something that happens at all ages, but that pattern is much more prevalent in older individuals. There's also the question about whether or not older people are more likely to have premature spillage into the vallecula, and if so, is this normal? The evidence suggests that both of these things are true, that there is some premature spillage into the vallecula, but it is considered normal as long as the pharyngeal phase of the swallow is triggered as the tail of the bolus is leaving the ramus of the mandible. At the pharyngeal stage or stages, timing continues to be slowed. Again, this leads to increased transit time at this stage as well as the oral stage. There's some evidence of slower pharyngeal contraction, that the apneic moment of the swallow lasts longer, and that the bolus can be lower in the pharynx before the swallow reflex is triggered. And that makes sense given what we had just said about premature spillage. We also know that other aspects of the swallow either take longer or are less in terms of range of motion, the latter in the case of the hyolaryngeal complex. Older people do tend to cough more after they swallow, but this is not really well understood because they also have decreased pharyngeal sensitivity. So to me, this suggests that they may have more penetration, at least a sensation of penetration, but at the same time, overall sensitivity in the pharyngeal region is less than we might expect. Finally, the PES opening is delayed. That, I think, it can be explained on the basis of some of the other factors about slower timing. The bolus is farther before things get triggered. At the esophageal stage, there are primarily two things that have been noted. One is that peristalsis, once the food is in the esophagus, is somewhat reduced, and that there is a slower transit all the way through the esophagus to the point of the lower esophageal sphincter so that the food can empty into the stomach. Well, so what does this mean? I think the important things to remember about swallowing and normal aging is what are the common aspects of swallowing that seem to be somewhat different in aging. So those would be things like overall slower, reduced sensory receptors and information, changes in the structure that are associated with normal aging. And that just as we might expect with very young cases, as you will see later in the course, that it might be the case that there is a range of normal, that the things we expect from a competent swallower who is a young adult may be very different than what we might expect in the very, very young and in the elderly. Finally, I want to talk to you about the phenomenon of pathologizing behavior that is actually normal. Even clinicians that I have worked with before have been very concerned in their patients when doing swallowing evaluations because of changes it seemed to me were related to the age of their clients. So when clients are in their 80s and 90s, it's very important to remember that those patterns of behavior, while not interfering with a safe and competent swallow, might still characterize the performance of someone who's elderly.